His diplomats and the United States military high command were left with no option. Relations with the USSR were tense and deteriorating, but had to be preserved. If they were going to save their missing men, not to mention the other Allied ex-prisoners, from starvation, imprisonment, and death, they would have to go undercover. The Office of Strategic Services, forerunner of the CIA, provided the means. The options were limited. The OSS European branch, based in London, had no established presence in the regions where the POW camps were. However, the United States did have just one small foothold in Soviet-occupied territory: the airbase at Poltava, in the Ukraine. Earlier in the war, the Russians had allowed an American unit to be set up there to service long-distance shuttle bombing operations from England and Italy. The shuttle missions had ended by late 1944, and Eastern Command had been scaled down to a tiny winter detachment with few duties, almost forgotten, just waiting for the war to end. Poltava, a tiny dot of freedom in a sea of communist red, would be the base for the Covert rescue mission. They had the location, they had the mission. All they needed was a man to undertake it. My father was a regular guy, not quite what you'd call ordinary, but not noticeably exceptional either. Not a bad father for someone whose own dad had deserted his wife and children. Dad was faithful and did his best, despite the lack of a role model. As a citizen, he did his duty in the war and survived, then came home and raised a family. I couldn't have told you anything extraordinary about him had it not been for an astonishing confession when he was 86 years old, which revealed a whole period in his life that I knew nothing about. The events that led to his confession began on a hot summer day in 2005, when Dad was working alone in the communal garden of his retirement community. After a couple of hours under the sun, he began to feel dizzy. He'd forgotten to bring his medicine and water. Rising from his work, he felt faint. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. He lay there for hours before he was found, sunburned and close to death. But Robert Trimble had always been a survivor. Around noon of his second day in the Willow Valley Manor Infirmary, he was done lying in bed. Without permission, he got up and dressed himself in the dirty, sweaty gardening clothes he'd been brought in wearing. Having paid a visit down the hall to his dear wife Eleanor — her dementia had confined her permanently to the infirmary — he was back in his own apartment. He got some homemade bean soup out of the refrigerator, then turned on the ball game. After dinner, he put on his cap, the one with his World War II squadron insignia, and headed back to the garden. Dad's fall made me realize that the time I had left with him and Mom was limited. And so, in the winter of 2006, I began the first of several long drives up from Virginia to Pennsylvania. I needed Dad to help me get reacquainted with my heritage. I knew he'd been a bomber pilot in the war, and I wanted to hear those stories again in detail and learn more about his earlier life. He had been a mystery throughout my life. He was a sociable, friendly kind of guy, yet he wasn't someone we children could share our troubles with intimately. He had even greater difficulty sharing his own feelings. He was kind and caring, but none of us had a close personal relationship with him in our younger days. He was a disciplinarian, so I tended to steer clear of him when I was in trouble, which meant most of the time. On that winter day, when I knocked on the door of his apartment, he answered with a happy greeting. But when I announced casually that I wanted to spend some time talking about his early life and his experiences in the war, and that I'd brought a recorder with me to preserve his memories, he frowned and said, "All right, if that's really what you want to do." He suggested we go and shoot some pool in the rec room. "Okay, fine, Dad," I said, chuckling inside that he was still deflecting after all these years. I was determined to get him to open up. I asked him